Hello, and welcome back to Echoes from the Book, coming back to you with another installment of Precious Peatlands. Today we are journeying together to the site of some of the most historically significant and globally impactful peatland cultures, the Netherlands. We will be exploring some interesting aspects of Dutch peatland relationships and history, including folklore tales, drainage, and the artist's approach to these landscapes. But first, we'll gather some context and historical knowledge about the critical role peatland ecosystems have played in the life and the legacy of the Netherlands. The history of the Netherlands is a history of peatlands. The two stories cannot be told without one another. The story of Dutch expansion into peatlands starts as early as the 8th century, when people began to establish stable settlements along peatland waterways. When populations began to grow out of sparse settlements, they moved and expanded, and surrounding peatlands were settled and transformed. Even before large-scale historical settlement, it is widely accepted that peatlands played a special role in ancient cultures as sites of spiritual significance. The territory of the Netherlands is defined by its low-lying, waterlogged nature. In fact, if population growth had never pushed populations onto the peatlands of what we now call the Netherlands, all of the country would have remained a vast, sparsely populated wetland. But populations did grow, industry expanded, and the Netherlands was born, all atop some of the world's most peat-rich soils. The more you learn, the more the old saying starts to make sense. God created the world, but the Dutch made the Netherlands. Large-scale peatland reclamation didn't begin until around 1000 AD, in a period called the Great Reclamation, a time when more extreme population growth created an urgent need for more agricultural land, and thus peatlands were dug up and transformed. From this point onward, peatland development intensified, clearing the land for settlement and agriculture. Peat extraction escalated as it became a main resource for Dutch families and industry alike, and peat cemented itself as a cornerstone of the Dutch economy. As industry and settlements developed, and the Netherlands became the Netherlands, the destruction and drainage of wetlands spread. Over time, this has resulted in our present condition, where an estimated 90% of Dutch-raised bogs have been eliminated through exploitation for farming and peat extraction, with the remaining 10% being under intense pressure from threats of climate change and agriculture. The story of peatland transformation in the Netherlands is crucial to understanding the landscape itself. The very shape and formation of the modern landscape, all that we could easily accept as natural from the windows of the intercity train, is itself a byproduct of the drainage. Ditches, lakes, plassen, and polders are results of peatland development. This story is not just one of development, of separating wet from dry, of transforming wetlands into something easily usable. It is also the story of what we now face, the intersecting and overlapping myriad of consequences of this development. Aside from the greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration losses characteristic of peatland extraction around the world, a characteristically Dutch effect of extensive peatland drainage is the phenomenon of subsidence. Subsidence is the lowering of the ground level that takes place when water is removed from peatlands or wetlands generally. Picture the squeezing of a sponge. Without water to fill the sponge and give it a form, the sponge shrinks and shrivels, as does the drained land. You can spot evidence of subsidence all over the Netherlands, from the below sea level status of Vondelpark to the lopsided houses in Amsterdam that seem to be falling in slow motion. In fact, the Dutch term polder, which refers to land reclaimed from water, synonymous with the extensive land reclamation efforts of the Netherlands, is an effect of subsidence. As ground levels drop, pockets of land are able to be freed from the watery entanglements. Widespread subsidence greatly increases an area's flood risk, a problem the Netherlands knows well. Roughly 65% of the country would be underwater at high tide without the constant water management technologies, including pumps, dikes, and drainage systems, which must be constantly maintained in order to keep the wetlands from reclaiming their historic grounds. Although peat extraction is now highly regulated throughout the Netherlands due to the disastrous environmental effects of its extraction, the Dutch horticultural industry still depends on peat for its potting soils, and the Netherlands persists as one of the world's largest importers of peat soil. What is commonly told as a contemporary tale of domestic environmental protection hides a more complicated story. The The Netherlands imports peat from nations with less strict regulations in order to keep up domestic standards, while never fundamentally altering the dependence on peat and never interrupting the disastrous climatic effects of its extraction, simply shifting these effects outside of national borders. The story of the Dutch and their peatlands is too enormous to cover in an introduction to our podcast. It includes a myriad of stories untold here, the history of Dutch peat colonies, the growth of an internationally renowned water management industry, the legacy of tulips and horticulture, traditional rural fuel, and ancient spiritualities. Although the history of these encounters cannot be easily summarized here, we hope that this introduction has at least indicated the grand scale of entanglement between the Netherlands and their peatlands. So listen on, dear peat lover, for a more detail-oriented and personal reflection from Isis and Yana, who approach peatlands in unique, impactful, and creative ways. If you wish to check out the source materials that were used to make this introduction, check out RE-PEAT on Substack and sign up to the newsletter. First we'll hear from Isis. Could you start by saying a bit about yourself? How old were you when you started developing a relationship with peatlands? How has it evolved over time?
Hi, my name is Isis. I'm a student at Wageningen University studying forest and nature conservation, and I work at RE-PEAT at the Bog Academy project, where we get primary school kids in Ireland out onto the bog. I grew up in Amsterdam, a city I was taught was built on peat, and as a kid I remember being told that to make our buildings stable, we had to put a foundation in with poles that reached this deeper sand layer under the peat. And I sometimes like to think about Amsterdam as this city in the sea with all the buildings on stilts right above the water. I didn't know what it was though, peat. Like I don't think I consciously saw a living, breathing bog until I started working with RE-PEAT. This organization really made me fall deeply in love with the landscape and its inhabitants and stories. And this love convinced me to study forest and nature conservation, learning to appreciate peatlands in even more ways.
Could you paint a picture of the folklore surrounding the Dutch peatlands when it comes to storytelling? What are the specific myths or legends that define these landscapes in the collective imagination?
I was never really told stories about the peat, though I've discovered some later on in life. There's definitely folklore stories surrounding peatlands in the Netherlands. It's almost inevitable with the amount that's around of it. And the stories definitely show a relationship to the land, just like place names do, for example. And there's a lot of peaty areas that still have names referring to the devil because it was thought to be the place where he lived and generally was not considered a nice and pleasant place to be. I think most stories in the Netherlands can be categorized under the themes of disorientation and otherness. The Dutch witte wieven, for example, are described as these ghostly women who would announce the next to die and lead travelers of the bog astray with their lights, kind of like the will-o'-the-wisp in Ireland. Other warnings about entering the bogs more concern like witches and the devil himself. And if I may interpret just a little bit, the otherness that was perceived in the landscape itself is echoed in those who were deemed at home there. All of these outsiders. It's no wonder that it provided a home for thieves and fugitives, and along the Dutch border provided people with a smuggling route where authorities would not come looking for you.
Can you talk about how peatlands are perceived today? As we move toward restoration, how do we shift from seeing peat as money back to seeing it as something magical? Is it possible to re-enchant a landscape once it has been industrialized?
So when we talk about shifting in ways of seeing, which I believe has been talked about a bunch more on this podcast, it's this shifting from one point of view to another doesn't seem like the point to me. To get people to care about and for a landscape, you need them to relate to it. And this comes in many forms. Scientists like myself have the tendency to talk about the functions a system has. We talk about water quality and flood resistance and biodiversity, and this is important, of course. It's, however, only one of the ways that we have learned to relate to this landscape. The coexistence of different relationships and value systems is very important in getting a diverse group of people to care. And learning from a landscape that is both water and land, and both alive and dead, we could come to see that many things can be true at the same time and strengthen each other in their overlap. On a more practical note, I believe sharing stories and myths together is a beautifully human way of relating to a landscape and sparking the wonder. From my experience, it feels like Dutch nature has gotten so controlled that there is little mystery or uncertainty left. We've moved from this sort of extractivist relationship to a primarily scientific one where mystery was never really beneficial. But it's specifically this feeling of not being in control, something the Dutch are obviously not a big fan of, that allows for a sort of reverence. I think we could use some of that. Peatlands lend themselves well to this sort of mystery, because without a boardwalk, you never know whether your next step could get you sucked down into the land. That landscape with no trees where mist floats over the pools, it's a landscape made for ghost stories. And I think relearning some of those stories, or creating new ones as far as I'm concerned, connects us to a different part of the nature.
And now we'll hear from Yana. Could you introduce yourself and tell us about your relationship with peatlands? When did you become aware of what they are, and what sparked that interest?
Hi, I'm Yana. I'm a multidisciplinary artist, and I'm currently finishing up my MA in gender studies. And through this MA program, I got introduced to peatlands. It was through a summer school, and we went to a peatland in the neighborhood of Utrecht. And this whole summer school was based around pure grief. We had this session about how peatlands, bogs, how they deal with the grief in a certain way and how they coexist with death. So we went afterwards to the peatlands there, and this was such a nice experience. We went to a quaking bog, so the person leading us around, they encouraged us to take off our shoes and socks and go stand in the moss, in the soft moss, and just bounce around. And I don't know, it was a very happy experience. I think that introduction really left a lasting impact, but also through the context of using bogs to think about these larger things like grief, it kind of showed me how these are very generative landscapes. You can tell so many stories with them, through them. So I think that's what grabbed me mostly. And also just the fact that these landscapes are very unassuming at first, but then when you get really close, you have sundews, you have mosses that are brightly red or brightly green, and it's so fabulous to look up close at them. And besides that, I live in the Netherlands, a country which was very wet but is continuously drained. So I think that really also situates me within this kind of absence of healthy peatlands. And being introduced to it in the first time during that summer school, it marked this absence, and it marked for me this issue in this country. And then that brought me to also RE-PEAT, where I now am part of RE-PEAT, and now where we are now trying to make a peat-free album.
How did the specific landscape shape your artistic interests, and how has your work influenced your relationship to your local surroundings?
So in my artistic practice, I now work a lot around peatlands actually. This is mainly because of my thesis being about peatlands, so I'm just very immersed in them. And also through my work with RE-PEAT and now. Peatlands are so artistically generative, and they are such an interesting partner in the artistic process because they help bring you so many new perspectives. Like swamps can be queer, their temporalities are all wonky, their boundaries and shapes are constantly shifting. I just had a recent obsession with bog bodies. I also really like the sounds of peatlands, so in a lot of my works you'll hear a lot of squelching and bubbling. It works very well together with my audiovisual practice, where I work a lot with these kind of layered visuals where I try to, or it started out as capturing memories in a video format, this hazy perceptions that are not only lifelike, trying to make it more realistic. And I think that peatlands are such a good subject for this because they are so layered and you can incorporate all these different layers of the peatlands or of this landscape. It becomes this kind of trippy world. And the same goes for the audio. You have these birds that are screeching, you have the frogs that can be very loud, and then you have the squelches going on. In terms of the media I mostly use, it's a really good fit, and I think I constantly am finding new ways to experiment with it. For example, now I'm experimenting a bit with synthesizers and how in certain modes you get this kind of swampy sound, which is kind of interesting because synthesizers are like this purely electrical signal based. There's no real peatland anywhere near there. It's kind of this simulacra through something that's completely made and digital, or well, it's an analog synthesizer, but it's like it's purely this electric signal. And that's something I find really interesting to work with. Working with peatlands, I think working as an artist with ecologies, or even as an artist in general, you need to be aware of your positionality and the extractive nature that a practice can have. Because of course I can go to a peatland, grab a handful of sphagnum moss and make it work with that, but that's of course not how it should go. So then I need to think about ways of representing a peatland that are non-extractive. So for example, for RE-PEAT and now I made a peatinator, which is a kind of tent where you sit and you have headphones on, and on the headphones is a soundscape of all these different bog sounds, and then you're looking to these kind of dreamy visuals of peatlands. And it's this transformational cocoon where the idea is that Dutch people get reacquainted to peatlands without bringing the peatlands to them, without extracting from them. So that's also what I'm constantly thinking with in my artistic practice. So all that to say that peatlands have been very ingrained in my artistic practice right now, and I hope they will be for a long time. I think as an artist working with ecology and specifically peatlands in the Netherlands, a country which identifies itself so much by this mastery of nature and mastery of water, keeping water out, it's kind of scared of wetness. It makes it very hard to see peatlands because they have been either extracted or drained, or they're underneath the polder landscapes and the grass on top. But it's quite hard to find a piece of peatland that is still intact. And if you want to go there, it's in the east in the country. There's some around Eindhoven in the southeast. For me, that's like a 4-hour drive, and I like going when I have the time. But realistically, I think for me, it's more interesting to find the peatlands around me. For example, some parts in the north of Rotterdam are based on peat soil or peat substrate, and also between Delft and Rotterdam, because sometimes I'm also based in Delft. There's this large part of this agricultural area with these pastures, and a lot of them also have peat substrates. So I often look at this soil chart that Wageningen University made, and then I just go to a place and then see where there's peat and kind of imagine where it is, and then maybe find some traces of the peat that maybe seep up through the floor of whatever place you're at. So I think that's how in the Netherlands I have to find the peat and also have to interact with peat, because there's also this part of this absence of peat that is almost more present than the peatland itself. Because once you get to know about peatland and you get to know these crazy statistics of how the Netherlands used to be filled with peatlands and we used to not be this country below sea level, but because of this absence of peatlands and this drainage and this subsiding of the soil, we have become a country that has to fight water, or like where these polders are kind of bathtubs, which if the sea level rises might be filled, and all the terrible stuff that is entailed in that. So I think living in the Netherlands, a big part of being with peatlands is being with the absence of them. And then also as an artist, how to visualize that or how to play with this absence to make it more visible for people and to show them how to look or how to see and find the traces of peatlands.
Your work dives into the history of drainage, essentially the unmaking of a peatland. In your artistic self-investigation, how do you relate to this process? What is the message you want to send out about peatlands?
So I guess this also relates to the second part of the second question, but a lot of my research, also my thesis research right now, is on how to counter these ideas of Dutch mastery of nature and water. This idea and this narrative outs itself in like this crazy amount of water infrastructure, humps, keeping the land dry, groundwater level that is super adjustable for farmers and where actually farmers have a lot of influence over. This narrative has created the landscapes that the Netherlands kind of identifies itself with, like these polder landscapes, these wide horizon with the windmills and the cows on the pastures is something that has been created through this fight with the water, or quote unquote fight with the water. And it's something that the Dutch really pride themselves in. They export this, they make islands in Dubai, for example. And I think in my artistic practice or my research practice, I try to not only look at this process and kind of make explicit some of the things that might have been naturalized. For example, this idea of nature culture divide that of course is not only in the Netherlands, but it is very present in this idea that we as humans live on an earth that is inherently makeable to our comfort and to our needs. So that's what I try to do and point out how we might be able to unsettle these ideas. And I think not only as a subject, also as a companion in thinking, peatlands are very constructive because they are inherently unsettling. They are very hard to define, and as I already said before, they have this ungraspability. And even though in history in the Netherlands, peatlands have been drained and tried to be subdued by the Dutch, but they still bubble up through the cracks. I did this wonderful workshop with Massa and Luca from also RE-PEAT, where we walked through Vondelpark and where they showed us these indicator species of peatlands, and that even in these super manicured parks like Vondelpark, the peatland still creeps on through, and there's actually a lot of work that needs to be done to keep the peatland from returning. It's the same on a larger scale in the Netherlands. The constant work to keep this water out, it shows how this peatland keeps creeping back. And of course, we live in a country that now it has a lot of people living in the polder. So I'm not saying like make a hole in the dike, but I think it does beg for the question of how to live also in a future of climate crisis or in a present of climate crisis, how we need to refigure this relationship where we also see peatlands as a companion and we see it as something that can help us and something that we might be inspired by for thinking of new worlds together that are not based on extraction, that are not based on this capitalist idea of progress, but instead that are more queer, more touch with our past, more based on the rejection of categorization and rejection of readability. I think if we use peatlands to think with and to become with, but also see how these landscapes are so necessary for our future survival, that we might come to a kind of companionship where we really work well together and can create a new world together, or a world that might already exist but based on better relationships that cause flourishing together instead of this mutually assured destruction we're kind of heading to right now. So that's what I would say. We should become together with the peatlands and we should be inspired by them and we should work together with them. And I think that starts in the Netherlands at least with noticing them again and finding where they are, finding where they were, and creating this awareness around peatlands that sadly has been lost in the Netherlands because we hardly visually see them anymore.
And that's all we have prepared for you for this episode. The history and present of Dutch peatlands is a fascinating story and a constant source of inspiration for our work here at RE-PEAT. But it is hearing from you, people who actually interact with these landscapes on the daily, is what makes it worth caring for. If you have your own story to tell, maybe you live near a peatland, work with wet landscapes, or simply feel drawn to these ecosystems, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to us on Instagram at repeat.earth or send us an email at info@re-peat.earth. We're always looking for new voices, perspectives, and stories to share, and who knows, maybe you'll be featured on a future episode of Echoes from the Bog. Until next time, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you down in the bog.